This is a good one. I'm going to start here. How can we apply these tips in schools and not just at home? Sounds like maybe a question for Dave.
Boy, there's so many ways. Most schools now have and are using Common Sense Media's educational digital citizenship curriculum. I can really only speak specifically to my district, but I do know a lot of my metro colleagues that have schools where the media specialists or librarians or technology teachers are teaching a lot of those lessons right within their curriculum. So starting in our schools, kindergarten through 5th grade, kids go to kind of the library or the media center on a weekly basis, and the teachers in those classes are using Common Sense Media. And if you haven't heard of Common Sense Media, it's another link that's in kind of the resource handout I showed you. Who in here has looked at Common Sense Media? Erin referred to Common Sense Media in her talk. She cited their screen time survey results, or the multitasking, I think it was. They've got great resources for us as parents, for educators too. They also have curriculum, and in school districts like ours, we use their curriculum to teach a lot of lessons, whether it's on things like cyberbullying, like Erin talked about, or your digital footprint. But it also, one of the things that Common Sense Media has started doing over the past couple of years is, as the national dialogue is shifting more toward not just screen time, but kind of this healthy use and balance, and the content on those screens, and ways to, have good study habits and things, their curriculum has changed to that too. So they are talking, and students are learning with this curriculum things about healthy balance, and things about, maybe putting the phone away or to the side as they're working and focusing on homework. Another thing we do in our district, we use one-to-one iPads in our district starting in kind of upper elementary. And it's a very kind of stripped down, controlled experience for our kids. And a lot of school districts are able to use software, if they're using Chromebooks and things like that, where you can really kind of lock kids into a lot of educational tools. And for example, kids can't use social media apps or text messaging or things like that on their school device. They'd have to go to their personal device for that. So there's some nice advantages for us in the education field that kind of lock kids more into those educational tools and apps than just kind of a free, wide open everything, like you're handing kids, smartphones with social media and everything from the get-go.
Excellent. I sometimes work in Lakeville Public Schools, and they've blocked YouTube and whatnot, which is, as a choreographer, can be kind of frustrating. But I get it. I get it. This is a kind of a follow-up to that same question, and I wonder, Erin, if you have some thoughts about it. Opinions on using technology in outdoor education, i.e. interactive exploration apps for trails, etc.
I think that you can probably guess what I'm going to say. It's complicated. It depends. No, I think that really when we look at those kinds of things, in general, it depends upon how are we using it, what's the curriculum, what's the pedagogy. I think really good educators can use all kinds of tools to inspire learning. And so technology is one tool of many. If it's the only tool that we rely on, and the only way that we're interacting in outdoor spaces is only by looking at our tablets, obviously it's just not great pedagogy. It's not a great lesson. But I do think we can trust teachers that if we use it as one of many tools, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, in their statement on screen time, talks about two things. One is, let's make sure technology isn't replacing adult or educator-student interaction. Once it starts getting in the way of that connection and relationships, that's something that then we want to take a look at our lesson planning again. And when it's used as one tool among many, and when it's not the only tool or the dominant tool. So I don't think we have to say that technology has no place in the outdoors, but I think we want to be careful that we don't over-rely on it. Just throwing screens at kids doesn't necessarily ignite their passion, care, and collective energy to care for the environment either.
Great. Here's one about that I'm curious about too. How can I tell if my kid is doing homework or is on social media, Netflix, etc.? Maybe for Dave.
Well, like I showed, there are some really nice tools to kind of help with that. Depending on the device, you could possibly turn on some of these tools. For example, students in our district that are using iPads, you can turn on screen time. So you can look and see exactly how many minutes you've spent and what websites you've gone to and time spent on each of those websites. But even more old school than that is taking the device and, again, I kind of believe in this gradual release. If your student is responsible and they're getting their homework done and they're doing well in school and getting good grades, they've kind of got a balance maybe in place, and you maybe don't need as much control as a student who's struggling, or you as a parent are noticing that when you walk by, they're watching YouTube videos rather than doing their homework like they said they would, or if you talk and do some old school things ahead of time, like sitting down, looking at the homework, helping them make a plan for how long should this take, looking at the clock and saying, well, then that means, you should be done by 7 o'clock tonight. So let's work on kind of that time management. And if they can't handle that yet, and there's still, it gets to 7 o'clock, it's like, oh, I still have, well, what have you been doing? Or I've been working on, or whatever. And it just, if they need even more time and more guidance, then maybe you go super old school and the device with the screen is in a common area so that you can kind of sit and do your work near them and kind of help monitor the screen and see what's going on. And then as they show more responsibility and can kind of learn some of that management on their own, maybe they get permission to, go over and sit on the couch, and you can't see the screen all the time, but they're kind of with you in the same room and you're checking in, and then eventually they get permission to go back to another room and so on. So kind of that gradual release as necessary.
The only thing I'll add is if you haven't used those tools, screen time and digital well-being, I think all of us, students, kids, teenagers, adults, wildly underestimate the amount of time that we're multitasking. So sometimes we use parental controls. It's like we talk of them in popular culture as like a catch and release, like we're going to catch you being bad and then there's a consequence. But it's also a really great tool for reflection, where a 16-year-old looks and like, oh my gosh, so many Beyonce videos. Like I just didn't know. And we do it too, where we think we've been focused, but we've picked up our phone 15 times. So when we can use it as a tool for reflection and planning and problem solving, that can really help, especially as our kids get older and they're trying to manage and juggle competing responsibilities.
What I hear in both of those things is what you mentioned, Erin, is just connecting and having conversation and staying in touch with one another. Excellent. At what age do you recommend giving your child full unrestricted access to their phone? Never.
Erin and I were talking about this beforehand.
I still don't have it.
We actually talked about this right before the talk, and or maybe it was with Hillary and Mary over here. We were talking when my daughter turned 18, and as technically an adult and is off at college. That's when we kind of let go of the reins and I hate to call them reins as much as like I mentioned when I was speaking, more guardrails. That I am no longer able to see her screen time totals and that, but hopefully in all the years that she's had this through guidance, those guardrails have been in place to know that should kind of limit those. And she's doing great in school and great grades and stuff, and so she's figured out that balance.
Yeah, and so often we get this is a little bit of a different question, but we get asked all the time, like, what's the age that kids should get their first phone? And I really think that, a 13-year-old is not a 13-year-old is not a 13-year-old. Like, understanding sort of why, like, why do you need a phone? What have you demonstrated that you're going to do with your phone? And working sort of in that gradual way to understand that this is something that you earn over time. And there might be 16-year-olds who still need a lot of coaching, and some 16-year-olds that are really, the guardrails are way off. And it depends on probably what's going on offline for them, as well as what they've been navigating online. So I think it's this sort of, you're earning trust as we back out a little bit, and then when we have to come in for coaching, it's not always by age. It's by development, it's by skill level, it's by wiring, right?
Two questions. I'm going to start with the one that's sort of related to what we're talking about now. How does someone who cuts back on screen time keep caught up with the rest of society?
I think cutting back is probably a little different than just going completely cold turkey and having no interaction online at all. I think we actually have become accustomed to knowing when things happen the moment they happen. And sometimes we feel like things are coming at us fast and furious, but just take 6 hours away from your notifications. And sometimes you miss something big, but oftentimes you haven't missed that much. So I think if we can consolidate the amount of time and get back to single tasking a little bit, we actually sometimes find that you can still be engaged, we can still be reading, we can still be scrolling. I don't think that the message is that media is a toxic substance and that dose for dose, minute for minute, it erodes us. I think the opposite can be true. So the question is, can we actually engage when we're like, I want to learn what's going on in the world, I'm going to go online and I'm going to actually do it? Because I don't know how many times you've done the slot machine scroll and you're like, well, there's nothing new. You're like, oh, one new thing, great. So if we just let some time pass and let it breathe, sometimes actually we have more to dive into when we return to our devices.
I'd add to that use the technology to help you. For example, Facebook users in here, you can tweak by any single post. If you click the little dots or the drop-down arrow next to the top right corner of a post, you can say, see less of this or less of this person, or you can tweak those things. So if you have someone that you don't want that's just incessantly posting, and in Facebook and my friends and relatives, I have some of those. I've gone in, and I suppose they might watch this recording, I've muted a lot of that so that at the times I do go check Facebook, which seriously might only be a couple times a month, if that, I'll see some of the most important posts. I let the algorithms that Facebook is trying to get me back and get my attention, let those work in my favor, because it's going to serve up kind of the most important messages that other people have commented on. So I can still see that stuff. I'm letting the technology kind of curate some of that and put it in front of my eyeballs for kind of the short shots that I go in and look at things. But I miss stuff. I've got other friends who are on there all the time, and they'll say, did you hear? Did you see? Well, that's old-fashioned, Facebook social networking. So I'm still alerted to a lot of those things.
Excellent. And speaking of algorithms, how much is capitalism to blame for the rise in screen time for the population?
I love this question. This question's so good. I actually think it's really an exciting time to be talking about capitalism and screen time, because as someone who did a lot of sort of critical media literacy work with old-fashioned media like television, a lot of the media literacy work, especially with students, that helped them get activated and fired up was about sort of following the business model. So once we understand that the business model of television is to get eyeballs to advertisers, you can start thinking critically about how that drives the kinds of stories that we see and the kind of narratives that sort of gain prime time. That ground is still well ready for us to talk about it when it comes to social media. There's millions of dollars being spent on students' eyeballs, on students' time. And rather than workshops where we say this is bad for you or good for you, I've actually found where if we can unpack the business model of social media, sort of who's profiting from your eyeballs, you 14, 15, and 16-year-olds, we can get that sort of indignation. And I don't want to get tricked. I want to be in control of my time. I want to help author the stories that I see that are important to me and my community, not just the ones that Facebook is serving up for me. So I think making sure we don't lose sight of the business model as it drives the attention economy and what it's doing where we look instead of where we're not looking. And I think not only for us adults, but it's a really powerful on-ramp for students to ignite their critical thinking skills about how they're spending their time and who's being taken advantage of where.
Yeah, I love what you said right there at the end, a critical time to help students realize maybe how they're being manipulated or used. I think that's super important to have those conversations with our kids, not just the conversations we hear in the media about maybe how elections are being manipulated through social media at kind of the adult level, but also then at the kid level, how are we being swayed, or how are you, as you're watching these videos of people playing Fortnite and you're watching these Overwatch gamers and so on, and they're putting in product plugs and they have sponsors and logos in the background and they're talking about these things. Why is that? How much money do you think they're getting for that? And get those prompts and those questions with our kids about why is this news headline this way? Why is every news headline kind of like this gotcha National Enquirer headline, like when we were in the grocery store lines back in 10, 20, 30 years ago, and it was just these outrageous headlines. That's what about every news headline is like now. But talking to your kids about why is that? Why does every headline make you feel you have to read the article? And why is the hook there? And what are they trying to do? important conversations to have, let alone if it's capitalism that is the root cause of it or not. I mentioned Tristan Harrison in my talk. They've got an excellent podcast that he does called Your Undivided Attention. And so if you want to give your attention to this topic, listen to their podcast. It's the Center for Humane Technology, where they talk about this very thing, about how our attention is being bought and sold and how technology, Silicon Valley, is working on this and steps we can take to combat it, and also some really nice positive stories about technology that's being developed to kind of help us and for good. It's not just all bad stuff out there. There's some great people in Silicon Valley and other high levels that are really taking a look at, how could we do this differently? I think it was Instagram last year, or just a few months ago, hid the likes from other users. So no longer can other people see how popular you are. That's hidden. And they're making some steps into that arena and really talking about this.
Excellent. I will share, back in the BC days before social media, I had one tiny unit in 6th grade where my social studies teacher said, okay, let's look at advertising. And the thing that I took with me from that one little tiny lesson was to think critically about what are they selling, why are they selling it, what language are they using to do it. And I've taken that with me. I'm 40, almost 41 now, and I still remember my teacher sitting there and the revelation that I had. So it's not just technology. So those of you who are teachers out here, that stuff does matter, and it does land with some children. Speaking of Fortnite, somebody asked, what are your thoughts about Fortnite?
Well, I mentioned in the presentation we don't do violent video games in our house. And I have a gentleman over here to thank for that. Aaron's dad, Dr. David Walsh, I've heard speak multiple times. A lot of great books. In the handout that I put up there linked, I've got direct links to Dr. Walsh's stuff and Aaron's resources. They've got great resources, but years ago, maybe a decade ago, Dr. Dave, I heard you speaking, and your phrase was, you were talking about culture, and the quote that you had was, whoever tells the story defines the culture. And you asked, what story are your kids living out in the video games they're playing? And that just really struck home to me and just really was a meaningful way to look at the video games and the content that my kids are playing. We're pretty old school in our house when it comes to video games. We've got a Wii, but it's like Mario Kart and Wii Sports. And my son has an Xbox with the car derby soccer, but they don't have any shoot-'em-up games. We don't do Clash of Clans. We don't do online gaming. We don't do Fortnite. And our kids are surviving. Okay, it's possible. It goes against pop culture. It goes against the norm of what people are doing, but it's an important stand that we've taken, and it's just kind of what we believe, and a lot of that is due to the learning I had from Dr. Walsh and the Family Institute years and years ago.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to that is, as we look at the relationship between violent video games and sort of real-life aggression and violence, we really think of it as a risk factor. So when there's lots of protective factors, kids kind of navigate a lot of these challenges. When we start thinking about it that way, it's helpful. It's a bit easier of a conversation starter. If there's other ways that you can bolster up the protective factors. So if you're sitting here thinking like, oh, okay, well, we have Fortnite in our house, and this is how it's going. One of the things that we know is that we can bulk up the protective factors around it, like talking to them about what they're seeing, right? Activating their cortex about, wow, I wonder how people feel in real life when real life violence happens like this. Like, how would you respond, or how are people treating each other? So wherever your family has landed on that, certainly being really clear about age-appropriate content and using common sense media and knowing that we know that violent video games are a risk factor for real-life aggression and violence, but around that, making choices for your family that also are about all those protective factors. So talking to them about what they're doing, who they're hanging out with, can really go a long way as you make video games a fun part of your family life.
Two questions, I think, that are more for the adults in the room. How do you suggest balancing screen time and work?
Well, I can talk a little bit personally about what I attempt to do. I mean, I think that there's this combination of digital, there's digital supports, which I think Dave has done so much to give us resources for the same things that we're using for students around homework, we can use for ourselves. The things that I focus on is what is screen time and what's not. So when am I working, and that's okay. It's okay for me to have screens as a part of my work. When am I not? And then trying not to be chronically multitasking my whole day. So we know that us human beings are not good multitaskers, right? Our attention is like a spotlight. It can only focus on one thing at a time. So getting back to calm ourselves helps us. It helps when we try to go back to single tasking. Maybe it's 15 minutes at a time where we're only focusing on one thing, and then we take a break. But sometimes old school tools can work as well. So for example, just being able to say out loud, maybe to your child, you are more important than my phone, and putting it in the other room and creating some sort of a habit. We have a resource on our website about creating a 3-step habit loop around new screen time goals. The idea is not that we're setting up this thing where we're like, well, at 4:30, then we welcome the children in and we have meaningful eye contact for 45 minutes, at which point we journal about our screen-free bliss. I mean, life is real. You have to look at your job. What's actually expected of you versus what has been fabricated or created as an expectation. Getting really real about these are the expectations to fulfill my job duty, and this is actually just stuff that we socially have created that makes me feel like I have to be always on and always connected. And then letting your team know, it's out of bounds. I just won't respond to you during this time. And trying to figure out, again, incrementally for ourselves, what's 1 or 2 changes that we would make to get back to single tasking, and then one space where we realize, nope, I'm doing this to myself. This has nothing to do with my ability to succeed in my job.
I'll add to that, you can use the technology right at your workstation or your desk, your home laptop, whatever, to limit some of those distractions. So in the same way you can turn off app badges on your phone, you can go into settings on your laptop, on your computer, and you can turn off notifications. Outlook email and email in general, by default, will put a red badge app icon along the edge of your screen, along your taskbar, to let you know how many unread messages you have. And the red is that alert color. It's amazing by turning off that alert how much more you can focus, because as soon as the red appears there's been studies done that your eye just is attracted to it and you're distracted. So turning off badge alerts right on your laptop, or if any of you still have the pop-up where the new message alert comes up, it's the attention grabber trying to get your attention. Turn that off. The studies show you totally lose focus every time you're interrupted. It's like some colleague popping up over the cube or knocking on your door saying, hey, got a minute? And you're gone for 10, 15 minutes of distraction. So using the technology to turn some of those things off, or single tasking, like Aaron said, close email and look at the clock and set a timer, mute your phone for an hour and say, I'm going to work on writing this project for the next 30 minutes or something, or the next hour.
Related, this person uses Twitter as a news feed for the day. I do too. What quality news options are there outside of social media? What quality news options, sources are there outside of social media? Like, where can they look for maybe aggregate news in the same way? That's not a scrolling feed. I'm interpreting the question. Let me know if I'm wrong.
I mean, how I try to handle that, I use Twitter as well, and I think, following is creating lists for yourself, even within Twitter, so that you're like, well, these are the people I trust on ed policy, here are the people, right? And so you're sort of creating your own lists. But then also, just trying to do some of your own curation. So, doing the RSS feeds or creating, there's all kinds of platforms where you can tell it, I want to pull in from this source, and this source, and I want a daily digest, and that's all I want. I don't want notifications every 20 minutes. So I think in some ways, just going back to being your own curator, and then being willing to let Twitter populate with some, followed up. If you find a new one, maybe that you can mindfully choose it to bring it into your own personal feed, as opposed to sort of just being at the whim of the algorithm. I don't think I specifically answered your question if you want like an actual name of a tech tool, but I think that there's lots of them that allow us to sort of personalize our news feed. We just don't want to get so personalized that we forget to see opinions that are different from our own.
Yeah, had a moment where I realized, wait, I'm not going to any other websites. I used to I had my big five. ICANN has cheeseburger was one of them. But I had my websites that I went to, and I remember the moment where I didn't do that anymore, where it was all coming from social media. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay, last big dreaming question. Do you think there will come a time where culture decides to completely break away from social media and the internet?
I'd say no.
Yeah, I don't see that time. I think that human beings are hardwired to connect. So it's no surprise that as soon as we created email, we found a way to make it social. As soon as we created a way to actually send symbols to each other, we made emojis. That's, I think, a really cool thing about human beings is that we are hardwired to connect. What I hope is not that the internet goes away, but that we create spaces that are more ethically designed with development, human development, adolescent development, and child development in mind. We haven't yet culturally said, this matters to us. We are going to create spaces that aren't just driven by profit, but are driven by the values that we know and the principles that we know guide healthy human development. I think that conversation is starting, but I think that it's going to take us not just saying turn it off, but let's get kids coding better, more engaged spaces. Let's see different stories. Let's create a different kind of internet that maybe might also encourage us not just to see different things when we go there, but cultivate the skills to know when to turn it off and turn towards a friend.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you all for your great questions. That was an excellent discussion. Just a few last things as we wrap up. Please mark your calendars. Our next EDTalks is Monday, February 24th. That one's on voice, power, and change, students leading the way. Our speakers are Amy Muirs, I think that's how it's pronounced, National Youth Leadership Council CEO, and Amy Cram-Helwich, Minnesota Urban Debate Executive Director. Details will be at Achieve Minneapolis, achievempls.org/events. Before you leave, remember to hit that survey or look for the survey link in your email. You can drop it off at the table right over there where you checked in if you do the paper version. There will be a follow-up email that will have links to tonight's podcast and video segments. There'll be some resources suggested by our speakers and more information on upcoming EDTalks. Again, thank you to our generous funders, Bush Foundation and Comcast. They made EDTalks possible. And again, thank you to Ice House for the excellent hospitality. Be sure to treat your servers and bartenders well. And last but not least, thank you so much to our speakers, Dave and Aaron. It was an excellent evening. Thank you.